Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about the art of the fighting retreat. So this week I thought I would address a recent question that came up in the comments. Hex Tabletop wrote, I always struggle with the retreat mechanics in campaigns. How do you stop a weak army from simply continuing to retreat from battles? Harsh retreat penalties? How do you do this without eliminating the fighting retreat, which is an art form and shouldn't be stifled? Well, thank you for that question. I think it's an interesting one, and I'll do my best to give an opinion on it before asking for the usual contribution from viewers. But I'm going to come at it from the point of view of the fighting retreat as part of a game, because I haven't played many campaigns, so I don't really consider myself an authority on that. So before trying to answer this question, I think we should say that this goes to the heart of something I've discussed before: asymmetrical battles. Now, these encounters, while naturally one-sided, have the potential to be the most enjoyable and challenging of games. Starting a game knowing that victory is not your objective can be very freeing for a player. Most games are about victory, so having a chance to focus on survival or delaying an opponent can give a player a refreshingly different perspective on victory objectives in a game. However, most of the games that I have played do not have mechanisms to facilitate an ordered fight and retreat, but not all. So let me start with one of the few examples that does have this mechanism within its rules. So a few months ago I posted a couple of video back reps about the rule set They Died for Glory, refighting actions in the Franco-Prussian War. Now, these rules allow for voluntary fallbacks of 12 inches even if those units have already used their 2 actions for the turn. The unit ignores terrain but cannot pass through other units or move closer to the enemy during this retreat. And the only penalty is that it loses one of its 2 actions for the next turn to represent its hasty retreat and subsequent disorganisation. In the last game we played, the Battle of Beaumont in 1870, with a superior Prussian army bearing down on a much smaller French army, the victory terms for the French were not to defeat the Prussians, but to manage a fighting retreat and end the game in a better condition than their historical counterparts. Now, as a Prussian commander, this was both highly frustrating and challenging, as well as enjoying. Trying to pin down an enemy who kept dissolving away just as we felt like we had them in our grasp. And the French in this game won by the narrowest of margins. Still bitter. But without a doubt, this was a great game that both sides really did enjoy. And switching to another game, my Bosworth refight using Test of Resolve. Now, the difference could be more stark. In these rules, once contact had been made between 2 companies, most melees end after an attritional grind reduces the losing company to 0 resolve points, and then it is removed from the games table. Now, this is a mechanism for some companies to be forced to, there is a mechanism there for some companies to be forced to turn tail and retreat with their backs to the enemy, or weakened companies can choose to turn tail voluntarily if they wish. But it's an incredibly hazardous action, as you would expect from that particular time period. And keeping, of course, with this time period, retreating troops are extremely vulnerable, and if they're caught in the rear by a pursuing enemy, defeat is all but certain. So in this respect, the rules do a good job of recreating the period rather than encouraging unrealistic fighting retreats which just wouldn't have happened. Now, other systems like Sharp Practice and Chain of Command can see units broken by a combination of casualties and shock, and retreats can be sudden and leave a gap in the lines for exploitation by the enemy. But once again, retreating troops ignore terrain but can interpenetrate friendly units which suffer shock or a lack of cohesion as a result. However, units that have retreated in such a way can have that shock removed by various different activations of leaders and things like that. So this does not necessarily spell the end of that unit as an effective asset. It can recover somewhat and come back into the fight. So in the much more fluid skirmish games that you can be found in World War II, you can be forced back, recover and return to the fight. Now, the activation system of these rules also allows players to choose to fall back, regroup and reposition, so merely holding their ground is no longer the only option for the commander. And of course there are other systems for handling the degradation of units and their ability to continue to fight. Black powder sees units with a certain number of casualties becoming shaken, making break tests if their total casualties are higher than their stamina value. Now, depending on the outcome of the tests, troops may fight on regardless, break or flee, or be forced to retire, but with the chance to regroup and return to the fight. Rules like Fire and Fury for the American Civil War have a range of circumstances where units can retreat beyond enemy musketry range and come back into the fight again later in the game. Both of these mechanisms allow for the potential of a fighting retreat, but neither are without their risks, which is to be expected for those particular time periods. Now, of course, I've only discussed a handful of rule sets from a limited range of historical periods. However, what I'm trying to show is that there are rule sets that provide options for battles where a fighting retreat is desirable, but only if it is historically plausible. Some rule sets will handle this differently, some well, some badly. But as someone who loves to tinker with rule sets, I would say that if you have a set of rules that you love but don't include options for fighting retreats, consider how you can add to the rules with your own house rules to make that possible. The only proviso I would add in is, first, it needs to be historically plausible, and second, no rule change needs to be permanent. So try it out. If it doesn't work, you don't have to continue with it. So devise an amendment to the rules, test it. If it works, try it in bigger battles and play test the rule mechanic with other players. And if it really does work, then share it, please. And if it doesn't work, you've explored an interesting option, learned a little bit more about the parameters of the rule system you bought and fell in love with originally. So do you have a good example of rules that allow for organised fighting retreats? Or have you taken an existing rule set and added in a mechanic to facilitate this? Or do you prefer to avoid that sort of game entirely, preferring the definitive unit removal system to make the end of its combat, to mark the end of its combat effectiveness? As always, I would love to hear what you think in the comments below. So time for a very short hobby update. So once again, hobby activity this week has been a little bit stifled by work and other factors which have eaten up several evenings unexpectedly. However, I have been able to get a few small things done. Now, the first of those small things was making more stake defences for my 6mm Wars of the Roses archers. Now, these are the hasty defences, sort of the stakes panged into the ground by archers, and I wanted to make some train tokens for these defences. So I showed you some pictures last week, that initial proof of concept models. They seem to work well, and several people have asked that I would do a tutorial video. I'm currently making my next batch, as you can see on the desk here. But filming is very slow, and as I say, a couple of nights this week when I would have been filming I've just lost to other factors. I'll tell you about that another time perhaps. Hoping to have these finished, well, I was hoping to have these finished today, but it's going to be next week now at least. And obviously once I do, I'll share some pictures and obviously put a link into the video. Now, I've also started this week to put together a tentative early shopping list for my medieval/1066 project. Once again, I'll be buying from backers. This time I want to make sure that I don't overbuy, which I always seem to do. So I'm trying to be very careful about specific orders of battle and the numbers of figures I need. Now, I'm not planning on making a gigantic army like I did with the Wars of the Roses. Small numbers of bases with the intention of fighting across maybe a 4x4 terrain at the most. I'll be using Raven Feast, the rules from Little Wars TV, and I'm hoping to emulate their mini campaign, which featured a series of videos a few years ago. Now, this is meant to be a modest project for the painting challenge, putting together 3 small armies: Anglo-Saxon, Viking and of course Norman. Of course, like all Wargamers, trying to keep a project modest and within reasonable bounds may well prove a challenge too far. Only time will tell. So as a shorter video this week because there's been so much disruption to my timetable this week. But as usual, please join in the conversation in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share. And if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from this channel, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling on.